Good morning, everyone, and welcome to, I guess, the opening session of the Armenian Economic Association. My name is Aleksandr Gevorkyan. I'm one of the board members of the AEA, or ARMEA, basically the reason why you all are here. And we're starting this with a really interesting presentation and talk and conversation with Professor Branko Milanovic, whom I will introduce properly in a second. But I also want to say, now what do I do first? I introduce him first, I guess. But I also want to say that I think this will be a really rare opportunity for everyone, for us to learn from one of the top minds out there, in my opinion, in economics these days. So, but more formally, Dr. Milanovic is right now affiliated with the Graduate Center at CUNY, City University of New York. But we also know him as one of the founders of the studies in income inequality, global inequality, where he worked, where he began his work really after defending his doctorate dissertation in Yugoslavia, and then continued to work in the World Bank's research department for almost 20 years. He then left the department in 2005 and wrote an influential book, Worlds Apart. He's held many visiting professorships across the world. I'm summarizing Branko because I know you prefer shorter intros. However, his main area of work is income inequality across the world and individual countries. He's published in Economic Journal, Review of Economics and Statistics, Journal of Economic Literature, and so on. But some of his most prominent books that you should know and should read probably are The Haves and the Have-Nots, The Globalist, but I'm sorry, the one that's titled Global Inequality, and the one so far published most recently is Capitalism Alone. Both are really fundamental works. You should really read his acknowledgments where he talks about, here's an interesting book, I think, and I just finished most of it in 5 weeks while somewhere away from the office. His upcoming book, and I'll let him talk if he would like to more on this, but his upcoming book is probably the most anticipated book as far as I'm concerned of the year. It's also coming out with Harvard University Press, titled Visions of Inequality from the French Revolution to the End of the Cold War. I just want to say that today's lecture, right, we'll talk about global inequality, but Branko is the type of economist whom I guess Robert Heilbronner would describe as the worldly philosopher, because he, to me, and this is now, I'm sharing something very personal, which might be surprising to him as well. To me, he is the encyclopedia, if you will, of our economic knowledge these days. And I hope we'll learn today, because from every conversation, interaction with him, I'm always learning. Even now, setting up Zoom, we'll learn some things. So it's a continuous learning process, and I think that's one of the most important aspects for us economists, is that to always look at maybe even the same problem, but from different angles and in different ways. Okay, I'll keep it quiet. Branko, the floor is yours. Thank you very much.
Well, Alek, thank you so much for this introduction. It was extremely kind. I really appreciate it. I'm actually very glad that we are able to connect. Just a small sort of clarification about these 5 weeks of writing a book. It was actually a very unfortunate, I mean, I didn't really formulate things, but it certainly took me much more. People think, well, this some guy is like able to write a book in 5 weeks. No, that's not 5 weeks. It's only the outline that took me 5 weeks. Anyway, so thank you very much for the introduction. I'm very happy to be there, even virtually, and hopefully this Zoom session will work reasonably well. So let me start with sharing the slides, because that's really what matters. And I think that you can see them now.
Yep.
You can see them, and it's actually much more important than seeing me. So let me say, as Alek very generously and kindly introduced me, I would actually speak about something which has been, of course, the topic of my research for like more than 20 years now, and it is the study of global inequality. Now, most recently, this is a paper that I did first draft about a year ago, and it's actually a much sort of longer term view of global inequality. As you can see, it's actually, the title is the three eras of global inequality, and it goes back to 1820 and goes until the present times. Now, this is not only based on my own work, it is based on work that I will mention in a moment by Christian Morisson, Francois Bourguignon, and other people. So it is at some level, and of course the work that I did with Christoph Lackner, which resulted in, many of you know by now, the relatively quite well-known elephant chart. So this is a sort of a summary of the historical work, plus a look at the present and a look at the future. Now, we may not really cover all of that, but at least we would cover, I think, most of the topics that I just mentioned. I start with a quote from Fernand Braudel, which I think is very relevant because it shows that actually what he says here is that inequality in general, but inequality of the world, is the result first of structural realities, and I would actually show them in a minute. And secondly, it's very slow to take shape and very slow to fade away, simply because these structural realities are things which cannot be easily altered. And however, once they have changed, they're again very difficult to sort of revise or alter the second time around. So let us go from the definition of the three long run periods. This is kind of essential graph based mostly on GDP data in the history, on GDP data from the Madison Project. Now, what you see on this graph is obviously on the horizontal axis is the years from 1820 until 2020. So it's really practically 2018 to be more accurate. So it's practically 2 centuries. And on the vertical axis, you see the Gini index. As you know, the Gini index is a measure of inequality, and it goes from 0 to 100. Now, 0 is obviously a theoretical value when everybody would have the same income. 100 is also a theoretical value with one person would have the entire income of the world. So if you start in 1820, notice that the Gini then was, as the best way that we can calculate it, and I will mention in a minute how it was calculated, was around 55. Now, what is important to notice is that throughout the 19th century and all the way to the World War I, you have a steady increase in global inequality. And it's quite important to actually keep that in mind. And as you can see, actually, there is a little bit of a stagnation at a very high level of almost 70 Gini points during World War I and the Great Depression, then yet another increase. And that's actually the first era, which essentially ends with World War II. Now, notice then from after World War II until the year approximately 2000, or actually depending when you want to start the third era, could be even 1990, you have an extremely high level of inequality, which is between 70 and 75 Gini points, much higher than we had in 1820. And that was what I called the era of the three worlds, or the first world of developed capitalist countries, the second world of poor socialist countries, and the third world of Asia, Africa, and most of Latin America. That's the world that many of us who were born in that period seemed like a natural world. But of course, it was an artifact of historical development. As you know, it was the world which was created on the one hand by the decline, I will talk about it in a minute, of decline of real income in China during the 19th century, by British colonization of India, and also by deindustrialization of India during that period. So around the turn of the 21st century, what happens? As you notice here, what I called the rise of Asia, or what happens is essentially that China and other Asian countries, India, Indonesia, Vietnam, and so forth, begin to grow at a much higher rates than they grew historically, and in a much higher rates than the developed or Western countries. So that produces exactly the opposite effect of what was the case in the early 19th century. You now have the decline of global inequality. And the decline comes from the fact that poorer countries, or obviously countries like India and China, which were quite poor, were catching up, or at least they had the growth rates, and they have the growth rate per capita, which is higher than the growth rate of the rich world. Now, as you have noticed so far, I've really spoken mostly, or actually entirely, about the growth rates and about differential growth of different countries and different regions in terms of GDP per capita. So what is the role of within national inequality? And then we will talk about that in a minute, because the global inequality is a composite of two things, of the differences in per capita incomes of the countries and of within national inequalities. Now, it happens that when you look at that inequality globally, it happens that the between country inequality, or in other words, differences in GDP per capita, are the dominant force. Within national inequality plays an important role, but it is a subsidiary role compared to what happens to GDPs. So now let us then divide this overall inequality in these two forces. The first one is the blue bar, which is inequality between countries or between nations, where you actually measure inequality between nations by comparing mean incomes between the countries and use that sort of differences by weighting by population. In other words, obviously, if the difference is large between large countries like China and the US, or China and India and so forth, that makes much more of an importance for global inequality than the differences between smaller countries, like suppose Armenia or Georgia, or they would not have obviously an impact that big countries would have. So this is the blue bar. Now notice that in the early 19th century, the blue bar is very, very low, because the gaps between the nation states were quite small. Even when you take, according to the medicines data, the largest gap between the Netherlands and the UK, which were the most developed, and China, and Sri Lanka, for example, in those days called Ceylon, which were poor, the gap was 4-1. As you know, nowadays, the gap between the richest and the poorest country, even if you sort of accept countries, if you drop out countries like United Arab Emirates and the others, the gap is 100-1. So what you notice is that in the 19th century, the blue bar keeps on rising. And the blue bar keeps on rising for the reasons that I mentioned before, is that essentially the West becomes richer and richer, and large chunks of the world, in particular China and India, decline or stagnate. And that creates this very big gap between nation states, which drives the blue bar. You notice then in the blue bar in the 20th century is more or less stable at a very high level. And then what do you see in the 21st century? What I already mentioned before, the blue bar actually starts shrinking. And this is the main force behind the decline in global inequality in the last 30 years. It is essentially the rise of Asia and the shrinking between country income differences. Now, when we look at the red bar, this accounts for inequalities within nation states. So if you want to kind of sort of imagine what it is, it's essentially the inequality between different classes in the 19th century, between landlords, capitalists, and workers, and also inequality, obviously, between individuals or the elite and individuals, or the top 1% and everybody else in the 20th century. So in the 21st century. So there you see actually in the 19th century, the red bar going up as well. So what was interesting in the 19th century is that you have two forces of global inequality working in unison to increase global inequality. Between country inequality went up, and within national inequalities went up. In the 20th century, you see the blue bar, or between country inequalities, at an extremely high level throughout the entire period, and the red bar shrinking as the welfare state took place in the rich world, as communist revolutions happen in China and Vietnam, as inequality in the Soviet Union was relatively limited. So you have actually the red part of the bar being relatively less important. And then finally, we come to the recent period where, as I said before, the blue bar shrinks, but the red bar now increases. And this is actually the reflection of what we all know. And this is the increasing within national inequalities in the current period. So to summarize the current period, you could say that it is very interesting in the sense that between country inequalities are going down, and that's the predominant force. But that force is to some extent offset by the increase within national inequalities. And that's why the red bar is going up. So this would be in very general terms, the evolution of global inequality in the last 2 centuries. Now, I have to say, and I will not go into that maybe until you later ask me questions about the source of data, because obviously in the 19th century, we really have very sporadic data on within national inequalities. It is based on social tables, it is based on some fiscal data, but a lot of that is really guesswork. When we come to 1950, 1960 and onwards until the present, we have the data from household surveys, and obviously within national inequalities are much better sort of comprehended, included, and studied. It is also true that, of course, now we start also using the fiscal data for within national inequalities, and it's also true that the number of countries has increased in the 21st century compared to what it was 100 years ago. So there is an endogenous source of which pushes inequality up to the extent that there are more countries, and then actually there is more information on within national inequality. But this is not, I have to say, this is not an important factor in what we see. So let me just go to the next slide and continue with a much more sort of present time, although I cannot, for some reason, let me see why my slides. Okay, it is working now. So what I actually have here, as you can see in the title, I would like to focus on what I call the greatest reshuffle of individual income positions since the Industrial Revolution. To make it very sort of intuitive, what I'm going to show you here is that the positions of people from different countries are now changing very rapidly because of the rise of Asia, because of the rise of China, India, Indonesia, Vietnam, Thailand, as I mentioned before. And that means that if somebody's position goes up in the global pecking order, it is obvious that somebody else's position has to go down. So this is in essentially what is now happening, especially with China being so large and growing so rapidly. The Chinese middle class and the upper class are sort of taking positionally places in the global income distribution, which in the past were to some extent reserved for people from the rich countries, from the West. So this is really this global reshuffling. So let me sort of show you what, of course, you know, what is behind this reshuffling. Behind the reshuffling is, of course, a dramatic change in the global income positions between Asian countries and the West. You know, on the graph on the left, you see the usual graph that many people have used, which shows the total GDP of China versus the US in PPP terms. And I have to mention that throughout the whole discussion, I should have said that in the beginning, the metric that I'm using is disposable income per capita. Disposable means that's income ideally after taxation and social transfers. It is calculated per capita, which means that you take the total income of the household and divide it by the number of people, and then assign that per capita income to every member of the family. So you see, of course, for GDP, which is also, you know, which sort of is also reflecting the changes, is the change in the position between China and the US, but also another one which is less well known, look at the change in the position between India and Germany. In the 1970s or 1980s, the share of India's GDP in the world was 3%, and Germany's was 7%. Well, these percentages have now been entirely reversed. India's is at 8%, as you can see here, and Germany's at 3%. So if you have such dramatic changes, they are of course reflected in people's incomes and in household surveys and in their positions in global income distribution. So this is what I'm going to discuss next. You see in this graph the change in the shape of the global income distribution. Look at 1988 graph with, of course, I'm sorry, annual real income on the horizontal axis, and this is the density function or distribution function, which is shown here. In 1988, you had most of the world really at first low levels of income, and secondly, very much all bunched together. You notice that there was a very high, there was a peak at relatively low incomes below $1,000 in real terms. These are like $90 in 1988. Now compare that with the distribution today or the distribution in 2018, because these are the most recent data that I have. You see many more people in the middle of the global income distribution. Now, these are not people that you can kind of easily call the global middle class, and I avoid that term. I prefer to use the term global median class, because when you say the middle class, many people associate that with a relatively high level of income, and basically by the middle class income in the Western countries. But of course, these people who are in the middle there are much poorer, but there are quite a few of them in the middle of the global income distribution. So for maybe the first time in the last 2 centuries, for sure for the first time in the last 2 centuries, we have a global income distribution that kind of looks similar to income distributions in the individual countries. Because as many of you have studied maybe income distribution, you know that generally speaking, it tends to be close to log normal. And notice here that the x-axis is in log terms, and we have sort of a bell-shaped curve, almost a bell-shaped curve. So we have now globally a distribution that kind of resembles distributions in individual countries, which is really a big change compared to the past, where we had really a very heavy bunching of people at the lower part of the global income distribution. And that, of course, doesn't mean that the gaps between the poor and rich countries have disappeared. The gaps are still very significant. And here I took what the world systems theory sort of uses the concept of core, which is essentially Western countries, and the periphery. So if I take as a periphery everybody who is not Western and who is not China, as you notice here, there are really two very different distributions. In other words, the periphery is still significantly below, in terms of real incomes, below the core, and it is the shape of the distribution that was in the previous graph, you can see now very clearly, is driven very significantly and to the very large extent by China, by what happened in China over the last 40 years, unprecedented growth in terms of speed and in terms of the number of people who were involved in that growth. Of course, when you take the absolute, I will skip maybe that, this is like the distribution of the world in absolute amounts, then of course it looks very different, because the right end tail in every distribution, and certainly in global income distribution, is very long. You have people with, as you can see here, with $500,000 per capita or 1 million and so on. So obviously the right end tail is very, very long and very, very small. So what was the effect of what I could call, or we could call, the high globalization between 1988 and 2008? This is shown in the graph that I would only very briefly sketch this and explain. This is the graph which goes by the name of the elephant chart. It was first done by Christoph Wagner and myself. And the graph shows you the 3 salient points in the global income distribution. It shows you on the vertical axis the real growth at different percentile of global income distribution between 1988 and 2008. Now, notice, which is not surprising in light of what I said before, that at the point A, which is the middle of the global income distribution, you had a very high increase in real incomes. And that essentially, that's where the China or the Chinese middle class and Chinese upper class are between 1988 and 2008. They are actually growing very fast. This is the sort of a summary number of people who are at the 50th or 60th percentile in the world, which actually underplays the importance of China, because Chinese deciles in that period of 20 years have grown by 3 times in real terms. But nevertheless, let's call the point A as essentially China. Then you have point B. Now, what do you notice at point B? At point B, you notice that actually there is almost absence of real income growth, but people at point B are quite significantly better off than people at point A. Then you look, who are people at point B? Overwhelmingly, actually 90% of people at that point are from the rich Western countries, but lower parts of their income distributions. So you have, if you take the 3 large countries, like Germany, Japan, and the US, the 3 of them include 500 million people. One half of, the lower part of the distribution, let's say everybody below the median, is 250 million people. And these people had really very low rate of growth, real growth, between 1988 and 2008. So they're at point B. And finally, you come to point C, which is either the top 1% or the top 2 or 3% in the world. And there you notice very high real income growth. So essentially, these 3 points show you what happened during the high globalization. And why the graph became so popular is that in terms of policies for the rich countries, it highlights the trade-off or the dilemma that you face then. If you're at a point B and say, okay, let's suppose the US middle class did not really grow in terms of income as much as I was hoping, I have 2 options. Either I try to change the rules of globalization so that point A, which is China, grows more slowly and B grows more. In other words, let's suppose I try to reverse offshoring, I try to increase domestic incomes and domestic jobs and so forth. Or differently, I can focus on the gap between points B and C, which means that I leave globalization as it is, but I change domestic redistribution or domestic policies. The objective of those would be to reduce income growth at C, but to increase income growth at B. So that's why the graph, I think, became quite used in a political debate, because it's highlighted that choice. Now, that choice still remains with us. These are, of course, the 3 groups that I mentioned. Here you can see them: high growth of Asian middle classes, low growth of the Western middle class, and high growth of the top 1%. Now, however, after the financial crisis, we have had a change. We had the top of the global income distribution has really not recovered in terms of real growth after the financial crisis. So you had continued very strong growth around the global median, essentially China and Asia. You have still no improvement in Western middle classes income growth, and you have slowdown of the global top 1%. And that slowdown continued until COVID. And actually, I will not go into these details because the data for COVID period are still sort of coming in, but it has not recovered with COVID during the COVID either. So in other words, we do have, and let me just show you then the summary graph, what has elephant become? It has been like this, the blue line, 1988, 2008. Well, what has happened in the following 10 years is really a significant change. And that change is really a change mostly at the top, because the top has not, in terms of real growth, has not regained the high rates that it had enjoyed in the period 1988 to 2008. You notice the change, like if you look at the top 1%, notice the change that in the first high globalization period, it grew by between 5 and 6%, by about 5% per annum. In the other period, it grows by little bit over 1%. However, in the middle of the income distribution, where China and other Asian countries are, we really not only do not have much of a change, but even we have an acceleration of growth. I have also to mention, which is very important and may not be obvious at the first sight, is that as you have reshuffling in the distribution, China is not going to remain at the position where it was. So when we look at the Chinese growth, it will no longer be located only in the median. It would actually have moved to the higher percentile. Here we have ventiles on the horizontal axis. So, the ventile like 15 or 16 are the 75th or the 80th percentile of the global income distribution. And that's where we are going to find now much more of the Chinese population than was the case in the past. So it's essentially China which was driving the developments both at the bottom and the top. Now, I will skip what happened at the bottom of the global income distribution because it's a very complex process of what happened in the period 2008 to 2018. Again, China was very important because essentially the Chinese population, if you will, especially rural population, which used to be in the lower percentiles in the world, actually has evacuated, has left these percentiles and moved into the above the 10th percentile in the world. So in other words, the lowest global percentile, where the absolute poor are, is now much more composed of people from Africa and basically the subcontinent, India, Bangladesh, and Pakistan. China has kind of left that lowest part of the income distribution, but it has had significant impact not only on the bottom but on the middle. And that's what I really want to show you, what has happened at the middle of the income distribution, where this big reshuffling of incomes took place. And maybe I would actually, after this, I might actually finish my talk because I think I'm already running out of time and we started a little bit late. Now, look at the left panel. This is something which is not surprising. What you have on the left panel, you have Chinese urban deciles from 1 to 10, and then you have their position in global income distribution in 1988 and then 2018. Now, look at the blue line. Obviously, by definition, each individual decile is at higher position because obviously the decile number 10 is richer than decile number 9, decile number 9 is richer than decile number 8, and so forth. And as we know that China has grown very fast, it is not surprising that the red line is throughout higher than the blue line. It is essentially what the red line says to you. If you look at the top Chinese urban decile, it says to you that Chinese top urban decile was at around 70th percentile in the world in 1988. Well, now it is actually the 95th percentile. So this is really unsurprising fact that China has gone up very much in global income distribution. But as I said before, if China has gone up, then somebody else has to go down. And look now at what happened in Italy between 88 and 2008. What you notice there is that the lowest deciles in Italy, the bottom three, have really lost their income position globally very significantly because they are within the range where they have been overtaken by richer groups from Asia, not only China, but predominantly China. So as they're being overtaken, their, of course, their global position slides down, even if they're domestically, they had real income growth. Actually, in the case of Italy, that's not true because Italy really had a stagnation for 20 years. But you will see in a moment, you can still have real income growth at your position in the national income distribution and be overtaken by Asian growth. In other words, if countries in Asia grow by 8% per year and you grow by 3% and you're with a similar level of income, well, obviously you'll be overtaken. The top Italian deciles, as you notice, have not really changed because they're beyond the level at which China is influencing things. But it doesn't mean they will be beyond that level in 10 or 20 years if the gaps in real income growth continue. So, as I mentioned, Italy is sort of maybe most interesting example because of the dramatic decline at the bottom. But that decline is really present in all Western countries. Look at Germany, the same shape of the decline at the bottom, and not change or even slight improvement at the sort of higher German deciles. Another striking example, and I've shown that in Poland, and people were surprised, is Poland, which is actually the country considered as probably most successful transition country. The only country in Europe which has grown, which had positive growth rate since I think 1992 in all the years. Well, what you notice here, of course, Poland was a big success case, but at the top, people have, of course, become globally richer. Their position at the very top has improved significantly, but not at the bottom, because what is really happening there at the bottom of the Polish income distribution is that you are within the range at which incomes between you and China are similar. So it could be a teacher in Poland whose salary grows by 2 or 3% per year versus an engineer in Shenzhen whose salary increases by 8%. And that's why there was a decline in the relative position at the bottom deciles in Poland as well. The United States, same story. You notice that also the bottom deciles decline. Brazil is very interesting because for Brazil, the bottom deciles do not decline simply because they're very, very poor. So they've been poor in the past and they're among the poorest people in the world today. So no change for them. But the middle of the Brazilian income distribution has felt the China effect. You notice that the red line in Brazil is also lower than the blue line. So there was a decline. And finally, at the top of the Brazilian income distribution, no change, simply because the richest Brazilians are, again, people who are at the top of the global income distribution in the top 1%. I have two countries also that showed, Croatia and Serbia, with the declines throughout. So it's essentially everybody's position has deteriorated. And finally, let me show you Russia and actually Armenia. I have numbers between 2003 and 2018. Again, the same story. In Russia, there was only an improvement at the very top of the income distribution, but everybody else has declined. And in Armenia, you have the same situation. The Asian growth has actually, despite the fairly successful or reasonably successful period of Armenian growth, Asian growth was higher. And consequently, people who were in the middle of the Armenian income distribution and even people who were at the top were actually lost. I mean, they were pushed down and they lost in global income rankings. So we are really seeing an effect which is present in all the countries in the world, but it varies at which part of their income distribution is affected by the China sort of influence or the effect of China. Obviously, the top is still not affected significantly because China has not become so rich to really make a much difference in the global 5%, but it has really affected very significantly the middle of income distributions. And for poorer countries, it has affected their entire income distribution by shifting it downwards. So let me actually stop here, but simply show the last point is the composition of the global top 1%, where the China effect, as I mentioned, is still weak, where the dominance of the Western country is still overwhelming. The US has 12% of its population in the global top 1%, and the US alone represents 1/2 of the people in the global top 1%. As of course you know, the global top 1% is something like approximately 70 million or 80 million people. It is rather 70 because we don't have the data for the entire world. So 70 million people, and the US alone is 35 million people in the global top 1%. As you know, 35 million people in the US represents about 12% of the US total population. You notice here there are countries like Luxembourg, small countries with 14% of the population in global top 1%, but generally West European countries have between 3 and 5% of their population in the global top 1%. But urban China, which you can see here at the very end, right end of the graph, has increased its importance, but it's still relatively small. You notice that now the number there, which shows 5%, that 5% of people in the global top 1% are from urban China. That number has increased compared to 2008, but it is still relatively small. So let me conclude here by essentially sort of just reminding you that we have looked at the last 2 centuries of global inequality. I think we can clearly see 3 different eras. And the current era, which started about 30 years ago, is the era of the rise of Asia, that it is the very opposite in its effect on global inequality to the rise of the West. It is the era of convergence and of the decline of global inequality, despite the increase in within national inequalities. And finally, that in the last 30 years, that rise of Asia is then, of course, reflected in global income distribution and in the position of middle class, essentially rich countries, middle classes, which has declined in the pecking order, in the rankings in the world, and has seen, of course, the period has seen the rise of the upper classes in Asia, which have now, and middle classes in Asia, which have now become sort of, their position in the world has improved significantly. So let me stop here. I should maybe, I'm not sure if Alek, I should close the PowerPoint. And,
maybe keep it up.
Then, yes, should I close the PowerPoint?
It's up to you.
I'm glad that we were able somehow to solve the technical problems more or less. So let me close the PowerPoint and then stop the screen sharing.
Okay, thank you very much. Hey, thank you. Hope you can hear. All right. Now we have some time for questions. So everyone just kind of get into the mood of asking questions, but I'll start first. I'll start with a very general question, Branko, and I think it's easy for you to answer. And the question is, a lot of economists tend to specialize, right? We specialize in whatever, being trade economists or industrial, whatever the fields. So why is it important for an average, any economist to actually educate themselves about topics of global inequality? Is it a fair question?
Well, Alek, it was not an easy question. Actually, it's a rather difficult question because it is true that not everybody needs to we have to specialize. So, for example, I've specialized. I've sort of studied global inequality in general and global inequality in particular, but I have not specialized and I don't know very well macro, for example. So you can say, why should somebody who studies macro know about global inequality? And it's true. But I think at a very broad level, one should be aware of these changes because they are dramatic changes in the global power structure, in the economic power of nations. So in other words, one could say, like, why should we really care about the Industrial Revolution that took place in England and Northwestern Europe and the United States? Well, we care because that Industrial Revolution entirely changed the world in the 19th century. Likewise, I think we should care about the rise of Asia because it is changing the world today. Obviously, and I will stop there, obviously it has impact on trade, it has impact on macroeconomic policies, it has impact on currency movements. So, we cannot just, we have to be aware of these changes. And that's why I think people should know about global inequality. But obviously, it doesn't make sense for everybody to specialize because what would I do if they do it to specialize?
Yeah, thank you. No, that's actually what I was looking for. Because I also remember the time when inequality, one of those topics that you just don't talk about in polite company. And again, it eventually evolved into one of the main fields now.
True, absolutely. It evolved because of the well, I think largely because of the crisis in 2008, the realization that actually people in the middle and rich countries have not grown very much, as you have seen that on the point B on that graph. So yes, it has really changed.
Yeah, okay. All right, so let's try with questions, please. I guess you need to speak a little bit louder. Yes. If not, I'll really repeat.
Thank you very much for a great presentation. I have one question, maybe I missed it, but do you also look at the consumption as an outcome rather than the income? Because I think consumption could be in some sense very tangible or maybe even more tangible than income for topics of inequality, and whether what type of a consumption each country does and how it changes over time. So that's a simple question.
Yeah.
But
Thank you.
It is an excellent question. I could give another, well, Alec knows that actually I teach the class and I spent like hours discussing the methodological issues. And you can imagine when you work with global data, these methodological issues are enormous. Even they are enormous when you work within one country, but for the world, it is of course much more complex. Now, your question is excellent. Like, what should we do? What should we really do global inequality in terms of income or consumption? The issue is that we really have no choice. And when I said that I've used income per capita, disposable income per capita. It is a simplification because in many cases, I've used also consumption from household surveys simply because some countries do not have income data. For example, Indonesia doesn't have income data, they use consumption. India, until very recently, only used consumption. India has had household surveys since 1952, and they have used consumption throughout. But your more deeper question is, should we really use consumption or income? And that, of course, is a philosophical question. Consumption makes lots of sense because it really reflects to some extent your welfare and utility, the number of goods and services you consume. On the other hand, the advantage of income, not only is it sort of more related to GDP for obvious reasons, but the advantage is that gives you the extent of what you could consume. So in other words, it gives you the power that you have. So if I decide to consume only $100 and I have 1,000, it's my decision. And maybe my utility is not that high, but my power, potential power, is reflected in $1,000. The potential power of Jeff Bezos is reflected in his wealth and income, even if he might decide not to consume very much. But it is a philosophical question, and of course there are arguments on both sides. And I hope I've gotten the question correctly, Alex, because I have not heard everything.
Yeah. That was basically the question. Thank you. Yeah, go ahead.
I think also it's a kind of methodological question. I wanted to ask about the way of assignment of income to the country. In the last slide, you had the outcome that I think Singapore, Hong Kong, and Luxembourg are three countries where the most wealthy people are living. And the question is whether this income should be assigned to these countries or to the countries where it is, to the source countries, I would say.
Yes, this is an excellent question too. I have to say that, okay, that slide is interesting because really I think in terms of double-digit participation in global top 1%, only the US is really a very big country with double-digit. As you have noticed others, and I don't have, for example, data from United Arab Emirates, you will probably have also double-digit there, but like Singapore, Hong Kong, and Luxembourg, as you mentioned, they're very, very small countries. Now, who is there? That's a very interesting question. In principle, household surveys do not distinguish between the nationalities of the people. In other words, the household survey approach, and there is a so-called the Canberra Convention for that, is surveying resident population. Now, that resident population could be citizens of different countries. However, I don't know, but I don't think that necessarily in Luxembourg or Singapore, we are including, for example, that many Chinese or Russians or others. So I would tend to believe that it's mostly citizens of the countries that are being, even in small countries, that are being surveyed. Obviously, in the case of the US, it's, I think, obvious that these people there will be overwhelmingly American. But it's a good question, and I think it's a question particularly relevant for the Gulf countries, whereas the percentage of foreign population is like over 70%.
Yep. Anyone else? Yeah, be brave.
Maybe just like a follow-up question to this, because we were talking about like household surveys. But aren't household surveys like notoriously bad at capturing top deciles of income distributions?
True, absolutely. We have actually reasonably good studies that compare, thanks to Luxembourg income study. And I have to say, this is a little bit of a self-promotion. I'm associated with LIS, which has been really collecting and harmonizing the data from the surveys for 40 years. We do know that surveys really miss capital incomes at the top 1%. So that's really the source of the differential between fiscal data and surveys. And in the empirical work that I did, and I didn't, of course, didn't talk about that today, but I do try to adjust for that underestimation. The underestimation is real, but it's very limited. We are really talking, even in rich countries, about the underestimation that is only at the top 1 to 3 percentiles, and it is almost entirely due to incomes from property. So these incomes are either business income, which is not fully sort of revealed, or income from capital, which is also, underestimated. But I have to say, and I don't know, Alex, if I have just one more note on that, which is interesting. In the fiscal data, most recent in the US during COVID, the fiscal data failed to capture lots of support given to the middle class during COVID because it is not taxable income. So if it's not taxable, it doesn't appear on your tax form and doesn't appear in fiscal data, but it does appear in household surveys. So we have, the trade-off between the two sources, between the fiscal data and the survey data.
Okay, thank you. Anyone else? Yep.
Thank you for the presentation. And I would like to hear your thoughts of the effects on inflation on income inequality.
Inflation impacts on income inequality.
Oh, okay, first I have to say that, of course, all the data that I've shown you are data in real terms. They are all in PPP. So in other words, they adjust for inflation nationally, and they adjust for price differentials between, obviously, countries that are very expensive, like Norway and Singapore, and of course, countries that are poor and where things are relatively, especially food, are cheap, like India or let's say Malawi. But your question was about the impact of inflation. I really cannot tell you much. That has not been studied because we haven't had inflation, in Western countries for like 40 years. Inflation, of course, was hyperinflation, as of course, although some of you are very young. But I remember, for example, when during the end of the Soviet Union and the breakup of the Soviet Union, of course, hyperinflation was present in all the new countries, former republics and the countries. And we don't know much about that. I would tend to believe from the past studies that inflation has a positive effect on inequality. In other words, increases inequality, because the poor people have greater difficulty finding. First, they keep quite a lot of their assets in nominal terms and really in cash. And as cash becomes less valuable, they lose. And richer people are able actually to save their assets better against inflation. So that would be my impression, but I cannot be really sure that it's always the case.
Great. Can I? Oh, okay. Go ahead. And then you. Go ahead.
I have a short question. The follow-up graph after the elephant curve, like the next one, the downward sloping
Yes.
line. the rate of growth. It seems like fair, like the higher income groups, they're growing, there's still positive growth, but much less than lower income groups. Is that correct?
Yeah. I may not have caught all the points, but yes, you know, that curve on the 10 years after the elephant is a very complex curve. In the middle, there was not much of a change. And actually, as you have noticed, there is an acceleration in growth. At the top, there is a significant change because there was the growth of the top 1% has not kept up the pace with what it was in the 20 years before. But at the very bottom, and I believe that was your question, is a very peculiar effect, because what has happened at the bottom is not so much that the bottom people have grown. It is rather that China, as I was saying before, China has evacuated the bottom. And if you were above the bottom, you then happen to fall into the bottom. Let me just put it very simple. Let's suppose you're an Indian guy who is just above the bottom decile. So the bottom decile suddenly gets vacuumed because all the Chinese get richer than you, and you fall back. But compared to the Chinese 20 years ago, you're now better off. So that increase in the bottom is a little bit an artifact of what has happened to the, you know, essentially rural poverty alleviation in China. I don't know if it's very clear, because in the bottom, that effect is fairly complex. Took me some time to figure it out, you know, when I was working with the data. But it is not so much that the bottom people have grown, but rather that the composition of the bottom has changed. I don't know, is this the correct question?
Yeah. Thank you, Branko. Just a few more minutes. I know it's very late for you, but there seems
Well,
to
it's
be
becoming early now.
Okay.
I have a question about self-perception. So can we track the same tendency if we consider those first some kind of extreme poverty, like a threshold, how it's changed, and second, self-perception and inequality, because it seems that maybe objective values of the distribution of GP not so mature as the different layers perceive themselves in position of other layers. So maybe such other things like political factors, the opportunity to take participation in governance and etc. also in nature in this inequality perception, and this drives some economical processes or political processes as well. Thank you.
I actually, the sound was not very good on this. So, Alec, could you just?
It's a question, if I understood correctly, a question more about self-perception. That it's not so much as the monetary income that determines inequality, but other factors, political factors, extreme poverty.
Yes, yeah.
Things like that.
No, it is true. This is, if I can mention, I mean, it is a little bit of a philosophical question, like the one which is also about consumption and income, you know, because as I mentioned, consumption versus income is not only which one we prefer, it's really philosophy behind it. Here too, it's a philosophy is income a correct metric? And it could be that for some things it is not. Maybe the correct metric is the political power. Maybe the correct metric is just, you know, generally power, because that power can be also exercised within the companies. You have obviously a huge gap in power between workers and managers or the owners of the companies. So I'm not claiming that income is a sort of all-encompassing metric, but I think it is an important metric, and in my opinion, possibly the most important, because it is positively correlated, including with power. And I think that actually, as the question, as the gentleman who asked the question implied, there is a political power behind that. Now, whether the political power is used to acquire economic power or economic power is used to influence policies, of course, depends on the situation on individual countries. But I think it is the correlation between the two is strong.
Okay, thank you. So in the interest of time, you have, okay, we have one more, but I still reserve a question for myself.
Okay, one more, and I will be very quick on
Okay. Vladimir, go ahead.
I guess this is about measurement over the past century, the number of growth in number of countries. And when you do this decomposition between within country versus across countries, how does it show up? Is there mechanical something that shows up in a country split into many pieces that are heterogeneous that will show up as increasing, I guess, between country inequality? But I'm not sure how to think about this.
I understood it was about measurement, but I didn't catch the rest. I'm sorry.
Well, I mean, you compare between and across time, but the definition of a country has changed over time.
The fact
Oh,
that
yes.
borders
No,
changed and things like that.
Right. No, this is obviously, we have no solution to this issue. Like, for example, if you look at the medicine data for GDP per capita, obviously the country definition, I mean, the borders of the countries have changed. I mean, if you say, even leaving aside countries like Armenia or Russia or others, take Germany, for example. The borders in Germany in 1870 and what is Germany in 1820? There is no Germany. You have different principalities, I think actually 15 states. So yes, indeed, this is a big problem. It is also true that with the increased number of countries, as I mentioned actually in the beginning, the between component by itself tends to increase simply because there are more countries in the world. However, this is not, even if you adjust for that, this is not the factor that explains that blue bar, which keeps on rising. So yes, it is, I think, a problem, but unfortunately, this is not something that we can solve. In principle, we include at a global level, we include everybody regardless of in what country he or she lives. But in reality, we have surveys and we have the data which are limited to the countries. So we do have a problem between the two.
Thank you. So before I ask my last question, I'd like to encourage everyone to follow Branko on Twitter, by the way.
That's very kind of you, Alec. Thank you very much.
Well, yeah, absolutely. And then if you can't find him, you can follow me first and I'll refer you. Hey, there's no moment without self-promotion, right? But I have, Branko, what I'd like to ask is really maybe 5 questions, but it will be just one. But it will be on a topic that I think you feel strongly about, but it will also be a topic that I think is relatively unexplored, not new, but not as explored within our audience. There is a magic word, you'll hear it, and I think it'll immediately turn on. So you mentioned how when something goes up in one region, something has go down in the other region, and then you brought up the core periphery sort of distinction. And in your book, Capitalism Alone, you also talk about how we're all capitalists, but there are 2 models, meritocratic, autocratic. So I'm mixing things together in the interest of time, but giving you a range of points to reflect on, because then it all comes back to, so how do we achieve some type of a global, I want to say equality, but it's technically incorrect, but more or less of a balanced situation. And here's the keyword, degrowth, the answer?
Well, of course, as you said, that you have several questions, and I will try to kind of summarize them. My presentation today was an entirely empirical one. There was no normative concept there. Now, when we move to more normative or political, as you said, we do have a sort of a conflict, if you will, or between political capitalism and liberal capitalism. That's obvious in the case of China and the US as representatives of the two. And we have, we can ask the question that some people ask me, why does it matter if global inequality is down? And I think that it does matter because equality of conditions across the world should be a desirable objective for anybody who looks at the world without national predisposition. In other words, if you take a globalist or cosmopolitan perspective, a world which is more equal is a good thing. Then instrumentally, you can say it is also good because it would be a world with less, well, you can maybe this is your objective, with greater efflorescence of national cultures, because you would not need necessarily to migrate in such a world. As we know, migration is largely driven by the differences in mean income. I didn't have the time to show you today, but for example, a person from Nigeria who goes to Norway, and he's a median income guy in Nigeria and goes to Norway and ends up at the 20th percentile of the Norwegian income distribution, increases his income, I think, by a factor of 6. So that's obviously a great sort of incentive for migration. So this will be the sort of a normative discussion. And finally, when it comes to degrowth, that's even more difficult, and I would really be very brief on that. I do believe that degrowth is not the answer, because in order for the world to be more equal and richer, we need to grow. But we have to grow within the overall constraints and I believe in that sense. Some people say that I'm a techno-optimist, and it is broadly speaking true. But I don't think that that degrowth is an answer to a world which still has like 10% of the, maybe even 15% of the population in absolute poverty.
Okay, well, thank you very much. Thanks, round of applause. And
thank you so much. And
very loud.
I wish you really an excellent conference, and sorry for these technical problems. Which,
oh no, it was all on our side. Thank you very much. You worked it out. One day we hope to host you here in Armenia.
I would be very happy to come, maybe even next year.
Let's
thank
try.
you very much.
All right, thank you. Okay,
thank you.
bye.